Yeah, hi. So I'm Stuart Dyke, and from Compliance and Assessment section, and I just wanted to talk about participating in the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme, including telling you about our upcoming update to our landfill guidelines. So firstly, I'll just give a really brief introduction to the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme, and I'm going to call it NGER from this point on, just to make it easier. So it's a single national reporting framework for collecting and disseminating energy consumption, energy production, and greenhouse gas emissions data. And if your facility or company meets one of the reporting thresholds for energy or emissions, then there's reporting requirements. That information is used for informing national government policy, supporting state and territory programs, and to meet our international reporting obligations. So, as I said, we're updating our landfill guidelines to assist with NGER reporting, and that'll be in time for the 2017-18 reporting period. Reporting for that starts on 1st of July this year, so that's when we'll have the guidelines ready. And the name of the guidelines are Estimating Emissions and Energy from Solid Waste and Landfill Biogas Management, which is a bit of a mouthful, but we just wanted to make it clear what the coverage is, that it's for both emissions and energy, and for landfills and electricity generators. So the reasons for the update are pretty straightforward, just to make it easier for people to report, particularly because some parts of the legislation have been a bit unclear in the past with respect to what the requirements are. And there's nothing worse for us than having reporters who are trying to do the right thing and find out the right information, having them contact us and us not being able to give clear information back and saying something like, please go and get legal advice. So it's much better if we can just give a straightforward answer to straightforward questions. It's also streamlining our documentation. For the solid waste calculator spreadsheet tool, there's a user guide. We've pushed them together now, so it's just one document. And I think a big feature of this of the update is we're clarifying energy reporting. So as I said, that's been a part of the legislation that's been a bit confusing for people. Landfills themselves do have quite extensive data requirements, and the new guidelines will provide a lot of information about what data you have to collect and what the standards are for the standards and quality requirements for that data are. We're also going to provide, as I said, instructions to use our spreadsheet calculation tool. So the spreadsheet calculation tool does a lot of the heavy lifting of the calculations, because for landfills, they are relatively complex, the calculations, and the data requirements are large. So we just want to simplify it with the calculator. And so there's instructions for that in the document. And as I touched on before, energy reporting has been a bit of a source of confusion for both the reporter and sometimes for the agency. So we're going to provide really clear guidance on when energy reporting is required, what activities require that to be reported, and who has to do the reporting. So I'll just give an overview of the emissions and energy sources that are reportable under NGERs. Over on the left, there's emissions from uncaptured landfill biogas, so they're reportable emissions. If you capture landfill gas, then energy production is required to be reported. And when you combust landfill gas in a generation unit or a flare, there's energy consumption and production to be reported, and emissions. So yeah, there's a few different points in the activities where emissions and energy have to be reported. When compiling and reporting information, there's some general, there's some overarching principles for the measurement and estimation. So transparency is just things like making sure you keep your records for 5 years, making sure there's a clear audit trail for the information, and clear documentation of any assumptions or decisions you make during compilation of your report. Comparability is simple. It's just basically use the methods that are in the legislation so that everyone's doing the same thing. Completeness is even simpler. Just make sure you don't miss any sources of emissions. So if you've got stack of emissions coming out of out of an electricity generator. Obviously, don't miss that. For accuracy, there's that means that you have to minimise uncertainty by applying reasonable resources. So that just basically means do the best you can. In the methods for estimation, there's a number of different ways you can estimate, but you've got to do the best you can using the best available data. That's the main principle there. An interesting or unusual feature of NGERs is the concept of facility. So a facility might be commonly understood to just mean a particular site, but under NGERs, a facility is a series of activities, and there is one reporter for each facility, and that reporter is the party that has the greatest operational control, and that's the party that has the greatest power to implement environmental policies, operational policies, and work health and safety policies. And I'm not going to get into that part of the reporting. I'll just refer to other guidelines on our website, and there's a link at the end of this presentation to our guidelines. I'll give a simple example of a facility configuration. So this is where all of the relevant activities are part of the same facility, and they will be reported by one party. So there is, so there's the waste management. There is the gas collection and combustion, and there's biological treatment such as composting. So they're all sources of emissions, and in this particular case, there'd be one reporter for that. So, and if you have a facility, we don't mind if you put some red dots on the soil around the facility in case we're snooping at it on Google Maps. I'm just joking, but yep, just about the red dashes. So here's another configuration. This is where the activities are spread across multiple facilities. You've got the landfill on the left, the waste management. Top right is the flaring electricity generation, and the bottom right is where you'd have the biological treatment and composting. So there's different ways for the facilities to be configured, and that determines who has the reporting responsibilities for the different sources of emissions and also energy. As I said, there's relatively extensive requirements in terms of data and calculations for landfills compared to other sectors. So in the guidelines, there's some step-by-step flowcharts and guidance in there. Yep, so there's a lot of steps, but if you just follow the steps, it should be okay, and it just makes it a lot simpler than trying to wade through the legislation, which is a bit complicated at times. So one of the key things in the calculations is working out the amount of waste that actually goes into the landfill itself, so which causes emissions, and that's different from what's received at the gate of your landfill. So a common mistake we have with reporters is inputting of, like, people work out the amount of waste that's gone into the landfill and input it into our solid waste calculator tool, and that brings up an incorrect result, and it's just a common reporting error, so that's in the guidelines if you follow the steps. And just to demonstrate that, so there's waste received at a landfill, that's reportable, and then also these items in orange are they're the amounts of waste diverted from landfill, and that ends up with the amount of waste that you actually get in the landfill. So it's just about following the steps and the guidelines to make sure you report the right items. Waste is categorised into waste streams. That's about that's mainly about where the waste originates from. The waste is further categorised into waste mix types. That's more about the substances and the materials of the waste themselves. And to work out those compositions, there's defaults and site-specific estimates. But once again, that principle applies of you have to use the best available data. That's the broad principle. So in terms of some of the waste streams, there's municipal solid waste, which is from council collections and trailer loads, domestic trailer loads going to the tip. And there's type 1 where the organic material isn't separated out, and there's type 2 where you have dedicated dedicated bins for organic material. Commercial and industrial waste, that mainly comes from retail trade, manufacturing, accommodation, and cafes and restaurants, that sort of thing. Construction and demolition waste is mainly from the construction industry, and it's mainly inert waste, so concrete, glass and other materials that don't really emit much. There are a few different ways to calculate your waste stream proportions, but for each set of circumstances there's only one correct way to do it. So once again, in the legislation it's a bit complex, so we've just provided some flowcharts so you can just work through them, and it'll ensure that you report compliantly. That was waste streams. And the waste mix types, there's default proportions, which is what nearly everyone uses because statistically valid sampling is my understanding, very uncommon. So there's an example in that table of some default proportions within default waste mix type proportions within a couple of waste streams. To estimate the methane content in your landfill gas, once again there's different ways to do it. So you can measure at the point of combustion, and certain standards and accuracy requirements apply. Or there's industry practice, which is under criterion BBB. That's more flexible and can enable, you can back calculate from the amount of electricity that you generated. And in circumstances where you don't have equipment, then there is a default 50% methane concentration for flaring that can be used. There's a requirement to report your emissions split up between legacy and non-legacy. If your landfill's huge, I don't know if many meet that requirement, but legacy emissions are from waste that was deposited prior to 1st of July 2016, and non-legacy emissions are from waste deposited from 1st of July 2016 and onwards. So legacy and non-legacy used to have a different meaning under another government initiative from a few years ago, but I won't get into that. But anyway, the solid waste calculator tool that we have performs all the extra calculations and does the heavy lifting. This is something we've clarified for this year, that emissions from flaring must be reported by the facility that operates that flare, the facility that includes that flare. So that's irrespective of any contractual arrangements between different facilities. It's just, if you operate the flare, you report the emissions. Energy production is something that we've clarified for the first time this year in time for the reporting period. And it sort of demonstrates that NGER has a bespoke use of the English language for legal purposes sometimes. So if you force gas into a pipe, i.e. use a blower or an extraction fan to draw gas into collection wells and into a pipe, that's considered to have been injected into a pipeline, which is from the legislation. And if it's injected into a pipeline, then the landfill biogas has been captured for combustion, and that constitutes energy production. So there's some concepts that in common understanding probably aren't very clear, but looking into the legal definitions themselves, that's what it means. So that means that whenever methane is captured, it has to be reported as energy produced. So that doesn't matter if it gets combusted or transferred to another facility. And it's the facility that operates the landfill gas collection wells that has to report. So the energy production is considered to occur at the point at which the gas enters the collection wells. So it's important, if you've got all of these activities spread across two facilities, then the facility operators have to have common understanding of who's operating the collection wells, because they have to report energy production. For energy consumption, that's similar. So if it's burnt, then energy consumption needs to be reported, and it's by the party that's operating the combustion device. I'll give a couple of examples of what I said. So this is a single facility example where all of the activities occur in the one facility, and in that case, all of the emissions and all of the energy consumption and all of the energy production have to be reported by that party. This is an example where you have the activity spread across 2 facilities. And in this case, it's the second facility, that the landfill gas management facility, that operates the biogas collection wells. And in that case, the landfill facility just reports emissions from the landfill, and the landfill gas management facility has to report all of the energy production, all of the energy consumption, and emissions from the combustion. As I said earlier, we're updating the spreadsheet calculation tool as well, the solid waste calculator. There's just a quick snapshot of it. It's got about another 30 columns to the right and another few sheets, but it's just the way it has to be. So we're updating that to make it easier to use, so having more questions in it. We're going to make it more comprehensive. And I just wanted to make clear that there's been no update to the legislation, so I should have said this earlier too. So the update to our guidelines and the update to the calculator is not because there's been any update to the legislation. If you've got any more questions after today, please feel free to contact us, and there's a link to our website where our guidelines and tools are stored. Thanks.